In a city where fortunes were built faster than human relationships, Ricardo appeared as the very incarnation of success. His name graced economic newspapers, linked to audacious acquisitions and strategic decisions that few dared to contest. From behind the tinted windows of his cars, he observed the world like a conquered territory, gradually forgetting the paths that had led him there. Among those paths was a modest house on the city's outskirts, where his mother, Olivia, still lived. 70-year-old woman whose simplicity contrasted sharply with the life he had constructed for himself. Over the years, Ricardo had transformed emotional distance into habit. His visits had become infrequent, first for business reasons, then out of simple convenience. Calls became rare, often cut short by a professional excuse. He convinced himself that looking after her belonged to another time, a bygone era when he was still a nobody. What he refused to admit was that every silence dug a void. That was difficult to fill. When he finally decided to entrust his mother to a specialized facility, he did so with the coldness of a man accustomed to delegating. For him, every problem could be solved by a contract, a payment, a signature. The day he took her to the nursing home, the sky was covered in a thick grey. Ricardo held an administrative file in one hand and avoided Olivia's gaze. The management of the facility, a quiet, clean place with light beige walls, greeted him with impeccable professionalism. He was shown the rooms, the care services, and the daily schedule. Ricardo nodded, distracted, already anxious to be finished. Olivia, meanwhile, watched in silence, trying to understand what was truly happening. Once she was settled in her room, an impersonal space where every object seemed to have belonged to someone else before her, Ricardo simply shook the chief nurse's hand and left. No words were exchanged between them. Only the sound of the closing door remained in the air. In the following days, Olivia discovered the mechanism of the place. Meals were served at the same time, the same faces sat in the same seats, and conversations faded into a monotonous murmur. She had never been a woman to complain, but she felt a new kind of weariness, the fatigue of having nothing left to anticipate. To ward off the solitude, she began to write. Small letters on yellowed paper, penned in a still, firm hand. She addressed them to her son, but did not send them. Each letter began with a soft greeting, followed by simple narratives, the description of a sunset, a childhood memory, a forgotten detail. Yet, between the lines, a different tone slipped through, that of a woman who knew things that no one had ever sought to know. For Olivia, before being a mother, she had been an office clerk in a construction company that had built many of the projects on which Ricardo had made his fortune. She had seen documents pass, heard names, observed transactions that people preferred to keep in the shadows. These memories had been dormant for years, buried under the dust of recollection, but here, in the slowness of daily life, they resurfaced. The letters she wrote were like fragments of a puzzle whose final image only she knew. One afternoon, a nurse noticed a strange detail. On Olivia's bedside table, several envelopes bore known names: businessmen, investors, lawyers. The old woman carefully stored these letters, politely refusing to let anyone touch them. Intrigued, the nurse discreetly mentioned it to a colleague. The topic circulated among the staff, fueling a silent curiosity. Some employees, after their shift, observed the comings and goings of unusual visitors. Luxury cars sometimes briefly parked in front of the entrance, and strangers would ask to see Madame Olivia before leaving without pressing the issue. As the weeks passed, the old woman's name circulated in unexpected circles. Former colleagues, notaries, even a journalist began looking for information about her. No one understood what an isolated septuagenarian could have of interest, but her name appeared in increasingly specific contexts. Meanwhile, Ricardo continued his millionaire life, completely oblivious to the discreet ripple. He signed contracts, attended receptions, and gave numerous interviews where he spoke of efficiency and a vision for the future. However, a rumor began to circulate in financial circles, a set of old documents related to past real estate projects had resurfaced. Some bore Ricardo's signature, others his late father's. These papers seemed to prove irregularities in acquisitions dating back more than 20 years. No source confirmed their authenticity, but the mere mention was enough to sow doubt. In her room, Olivia continued to write. She wasn't seeking revenge, only the truth. Her letters recounted with almost surgical precision the stages of an ascent built on moral errors and concealed betrayals. She still didn't send them, but some mysteriously disappeared. A nurse, believing she was doing the right thing, allegedly handed them over to a visitor who claimed to be a family member. No one ever truly knew who he was. In the following weeks, the staff noticed a subtle change. Olivia now received bouquets of flowers, without cards, recent books, and newspapers folded to the economic page. She said nothing, but read every word carefully, as if following a story parallel to her own. Her face, once tired, seemed peaceful, almost determined. Something had begun, a discrete mechanism whose full scope no one yet measured. Ricardo, on his part, began to notice anomalies in his affairs. Partners hesitated, calls went unanswered, and specific questions arose during confidential meetings. He suspected an information leak, not for a moment imagining that the source could be found in a silent room in a facility for the elderly. And while he searched for culprits among his associates, one name kept coming up. Insistently in internal files, his own mother's. In the quiet of the evening, as the hallway lights went out one by one, Olivia carefully folded her last letter. She knew that some truths did not need to be shouted to be heard. What she didn't yet know was that the lines traced by her hand were soon going to cross walls much thicker than the silence in which her son had left her. In the weeks that followed, the signs of something abnormal multiplied without anyone being able to truly connect. Them. At the nursing home, employees noticed a discreet stir around Olivia. Brief but regular visits, calls from confidential numbers, and envelopes dropped off without explanation. The administration, cautious, began recording these events in an internal log, without alerting the family. Officially, there was nothing illegal. Unofficially, curiosity grew. Olivia, still calm, spent long hours rereading her notes. Her memory, which many believed to be weakened by age, functioned with troubling precision. She reconstructed events spanning several decades, the contracts, the signatures, the confidential meetings where she served coffee while observing the exchanges between businessmen and political officials. At the time, she didn't understand much of it, but the years had given her a new perspective. What she had once viewed as mundane business now took the form of a network of questionable transactions, mixing corruption and concealment. Meanwhile, in the city, Ricardo began to feel the pressure mounting. His image, carefully constructed over the years, was sustaining small fractures. An anonymous article published on an economic news site mentioned a construction ghost project linked to one of his first companies. Nothing directly compromising, but enough to sow doubt. He had the issue suppressed by lawyers, convinced it was a jealous competitor. But the incident left a mark. He became suspicious. He demanded internal audits, required the review of old documents, and tried to trace the source of the leak. The more he searched, the more he stumbled upon inconsistencies he had never noticed. Some of his associates avoided his calls, others requested off-the-record meetings. In financial circles, his name was no longer pronounced with the same assurance, and in the silence of his office he began to perceive the echo of a past he thought was extinguished. The first suspicions arose when a notary sent him an official request for property verification. A plot of land his company had owned for 20 years was now the subject of a complaint filed by an unknown heir. The attached documents bore old stamps, signatures that resembled his own. Ricardo felt a new anxiety, a sense of déjà vu that brought him back, despite himself, to his childhood, to the time when his mother worked for the same company that had opened the doors to his success. At the same time, within the nursing home, an administrative inspector was sent to check the facility's archives and financial flows. The director, surprised, learned that the verification concerned only one file, Olivia's. Her fees were paid in advance, her stay guaranteed for years, yet an investigation had just been opened into the source of certain payments. The employees, bewildered, began to wonder who this woman really was. Some rumors presented her as the wife of a former minister, others as the beneficiary of an industrial inheritance. No one dared to ask questions directly. The aura of mystery surrounding her was enough to maintain a respectful distance. The weeks passed in a deceptive calm. One morning, a nurse noticed that Olivia had received a thick file, slipped discreetly under her door. She left it closed, placed on the table near the window. It was only several days later that she began to consult its contents. The pages, yellowed by time, contained copies of official documents, sales contracts, cadastral plans, and correspondences between companies. Some bore her son's signature, others those of influential men still active. As she read them, a pattern emerged, precise, almost geometric, a system of cross-transactions designed to conceal the actual ownership of several plots of land. The network spanned years and multiple shell companies. Olivia understood that what she held in her hands did not concern only her son, but an entire generation of entrepreneurs who had built their fortune on unstable foundations. It wasn't revenge that guided her, but a visceral need to set things right. She made copies, placed them in envelopes, and entrusted them to carefully selected visitors. No words were exchanged, but the messages were passed. In the outside world, journalists began receiving anonymous documents signed with a simple O, alluding to long-forgotten financial practices. Ricardo, meanwhile, saw his empire slowly crumble. Investors distanced themselves, and authorities demanded justifications he could not provide. He hired communication consultants and multiplied his denials, but the consistency of the disclosed information rendered any defense fragile. The published details matched facts he thought were buried. Every element seemed to come from a source that knew not only the figures, but also the exact dates, the original signatures, and the forgotten witnesses. Panic turned into obsession. Ricardo had all his employees' computers checked, searched the physical archives of his offices, and even hired a private detective. No one found anything, but one report caught his attention: a regular financial transfer made from his own accounts to a nursing home located several kilometers from the city. It was his mother's. At that moment, a chilling certainty dawned on him. The leaks were coming from there. He wanted to believe it was a misunderstanding, perhaps blackmail by an employee. Yet, the deeper he dug, the more the coincidence became impossible to deny. Olivia's name appeared in internal conversations between notaries, in intercepted email exchanges, and in lists of former collaborators. It was as if his mother, discreetly, was weaving the threads of an invisible web that was tightening its grip around him. Meanwhile, at the nursing home, the atmosphere changed. Residents talked about the lady of the letters, and some said she was receiving visits from important people. The staff, held to secrecy, observed the situation with a mixture of admiration and concern. The documents continued to arrive, as did the visitors, and each new envelope deposited seemed to trigger an effect in the outside world. An open investigation, an inspected company, a name cited in the press. Olivia seemed neither surprised nor worried. She moved with the methodical slowness of someone who knew that time now was working for her. Isolated, Ricardo finally realized that what he was losing was not just his money, but control of his own narrative. The people he had impressed avoided him, and former allies grew silent. Decisions once made with the arrogance of power returned to haunt him in the form of undeniable evidence. What he had considered an irreversible abandonment was taking the form of an unexpected return. And in that tense silence where everything seemed to be collapsing, a name reappeared in the documents of a confidential investigation, that of an elderly woman, Olivia M., mentioned as a source of original and verifiable information. No one yet knew how she had obtained all of this, nor how far. The ramifications of her revelations extended, but amid the turmoil, a certainty slowly asserted itself. Someone, somewhere, had just awakened a past that many would have preferred to leave buried. Olivia's name now circulated far beyond the walls of the nursing home. In the hushed offices of financial institutions, in the discreet newsrooms of investigative journalism, it returned like a mysterious footnote linked to documents whose origin no one knew. Each new piece of evidence that appeared in the press corresponded to a missing piece of the puzzle: old signatures, forgotten asset transfers, and internal correspondence that had been carefully preserved. The whole formed a pattern of disturbing precision, which only those who had lived through the beginnings of Ricardo's empire could understand. As these revelations spread, a strange phenomenon occurred. The millionaire's former partners began to distance themselves from him, as if anticipating an inevitable fall. The markets reacted slowly at first, then abruptly. His company's shares lost value, and ongoing projects were suspended. Ricardo tried to react with the cold rationality that had always characterized him, but he discovered that the published information came from archives that were impossible to contest. The dates matched, the amounts too, and the cited witnesses were indeed real. The origin of this evidence remained vague, but its accuracy was undeniable. It was at this moment that an internal auditor, hired to verify the consistency of external information, made a troubling discovery. In an administrative warehouse, he found a set of boxes containing accounting documents from an era predating the group's official creation. On several pages, Olivia's handwriting could be found. She had logged expenses, payment orders, and internal notes. Some signatures belonged to still living executives, others to people who had died long ago. These notebooks, preserved out of professional rigor, now constituted the solidest proof of a parallel financing system. Ricardo, informed of this discovery, understood that the link between his mother and these archives was no longer a coincidence. He realized that the papers she had in her hands when she left for the nursing home might have been used to fuel the leaks. The shock was all the greater because he remembered having himself ordered the destruction of these files years earlier. Someone had therefore preserved them, copied them, and carefully archived them. And that person could only be her. In the nursing home, the routine continued, but an imperceptible tension hovered. Employees received unusual instructions, and phone calls were filtered. Olivia, however, changed nothing in her habits. She still wrote, sitting near the window, surrounded by her notebooks. Some visitors entered her room with files under their arms, emerging a few minutes later with looks heavy with reflection. The most observant noted that these visitors were not relatives, but people from the legal and financial world. This discreet comings and goings transformed room 214 into a focal point of information. Outside, a judicial investigation was quietly opened. Prosecutors sought to understand how an elderly, isolated woman could possess information of such precision. Former employees were questioned, public archives were searched, and the correspondence of dissolved companies was verified. Everything seemed to lead back to the same origin: a set of manually kept ledgers by Olivia at a time when computers did not yet exist. These ledgers, ignored for decades, revealed that certain real estate properties had changed hands without an official transaction. Forged signatures, transferred accounts, modified names. An entire section of local economic history rested on these manipulations. Ricardo then saw his name appear in the first preliminary reports. It was not a direct accusation, but a series of probable connections. His lawyers advised him to cooperate, but he persisted in believing he could smother the affair. He multiplied press releases and tried to buy out media outlets, but every attempt at control backfired. The information seemed to advance on its own, carried by a force that nothing could stop. As the evidence accumulated, a certainty became clear. Someone was methodically orchestrating the disclosure. The documents weren't delivered in bulk, but in fragments, always at the most strategic moment, just enough to maintain media tension. It was a work of precision, led by someone who knew not only the data, but also the rhythm of the press and the psychology of the powerful. Olivia, discreet as ever, continued to write. She logged what she called the incomplete truths in a leather-bound notebook, the facts she hadn't yet transmitted, the names she hadn't mentioned. These notebooks remained locked in a metallic box, hidden in her wardrobe. The staff, bound by confidentiality, ignored what they contained. But one evening, a noise drew a nurse's attention. Olivia's door was ajar, and a silhouette slipped out silently, a file tucked under its arm. The next day, the old woman made no comment. She even seemed relieved. A few days later, a newspaper published a devastatingly precise article, the complete chronology of a fraudulent real estate project, with documents signed by Ricardo himself. The information sent a shockwave. Markets tumbled again, investigations intensified, and judicial summons were sent to several executives. The article mentioned an independent source, elderly, residing in an institution, without naming her. Ricardo understood immediately. His entourage tried to convince him to react publicly, but he remained silent. In his mind, only one question spun. How had his mother obtained all those documents after so many years? He knew she had kept some personal files, but not at this level of detail. He suddenly recalled an old scene at his father's death, when he had refused to help sort the family papers. Olivia had then stored everything in crates, which she kept in the attic of their old house. Perhaps that's where it all began. Meanwhile, a notary contacted the nursing home to report that a will, drafted years earlier, had just been updated. The document stipulated that in the event of Olivia's death, all her personal belongings were to be transferred to a specialized legal foundation dedicated to the restitution of illegally acquired assets. This clause, dated from even before her arrival at the facility, demonstrated that everything had been prepared with calculated rigor. Ricardo learned the news from a lawyer and remained unresponsive for a long time. For the first time, he understood that what he was facing was not an accident, but a decision. His mother, silently, had chosen to deliver to the world what he had spent his life concealing. It was not vengeance, but an act of restitution, and this certainty shook him more profoundly than all the accusations combined. The following weeks were marked by a succession of searches, interrogations, and financial withdrawals. Ricardo's accounts were frozen, and some of his companies were placed under judicial receivership. In economic circles, people now spoke of the most methodical downfall of the decade. Those who had flattered him previously turned away, erasing his name from their networks. At the nursing home, Olivia moved more slowly, tired but still lucid. She seemed to follow the events from afar, without triumph. The newspapers brought to her each morning carried headlines she read with disconcerting serenity. She never spoke of her son or the affair, but one detail caught a caregiver's attention. Whenever a new article appeared, Olivia would pencil a phrase on her notebook cover: "What is returned to the light can no longer be erased." One evening, as silence settled in the corridors, an unknown man asked to see the resident on the second floor. He handed a sealed envelope to the staff, specifying that it should only be opened in case of a particular event. Then he disappeared without leaving a name. The envelope was placed in Olivia's file, its contents unknown. A few days later, a minor incident occurred. A temporary power outage plunged the facility into darkness. When the lights returned, Olivia's room was intact, but the metal box containing her notebooks had vanished. And this seemingly innocuous disappearance would soon reveal one last secret that no one had anticipated. The disappearance of the metal box initially went unnoticed. The staff thought it was a simple routine shift, a storage error, or confusion among the residents' personal archives. But as the days passed, the absence of the object began to weigh on the atmosphere of the hallway. Olivia made no comment, asked no questions, and searched for nothing. Yet, those who knew her sensed a subtle change, a different way of looking out the window, a new slowness in her movements, as if she knew that something somewhere had just been set in motion. The facility's administration, belatedly informed, launched an internal check. Nothing was missing, except for this box whose very existence was nowhere logged. No inventory mentioned it, and no receipt referenced it. Surveillance cameras, although limited, showed nothing abnormal during the power outage. Everything seemed to function normally, except for a blurry silhouette in the hallway, difficult to identify. The investigation was quickly closed due to lack of evidence. Officially, there had been no theft. Unofficially, the mystery remained intact. Meanwhile, several kilometers away, in a disused industrial zone, a former collaborator of Ricardo received an anonymous package. Inside, a set of bound notebooks filled with dated, signed, handwritten notes. The pages traced the group's first years of activity, strategic decisions, and financial arrangements used to circumvent regulations. Some mentions concerned figures still influential in economic circles. The details were precise, the evidence irrefutable. The man hesitated before acting, but the fear of becoming complicit in the silence pushed him to transmit everything to an investigative journalist. The story then took on an unexpected scale. What the press revealed a few days later exceeded the initial suspicions. An organized system of corruption, tax evasion, and embezzlement involving not only Ricardo, but also former political officials and public institutions. Every published line confirmed a truth that many knew but never dared to name. The evidence was so consistent that no denial could counteract it. Ricardo, already weakened by the previous scandals, found himself cornered. His lawyers resigned one after another, unable to defend the indefensible. Media attention soon focused on one detail. Several of the disclosed documents came from the same set of notebooks, identified as belonging to a former construction sector employee, now elderly, and residing in a medical facility. The connection to Olivia was established almost by chance, through a mention in an old administrative register. Her name reappeared in newspaper columns, this time no longer as a mere witness, but as the initial source of the country's largest document leak. At the nursing home, the usual calm cracked. Journalists tried to approach the building, and photographers positioned themselves outside the entrance. The overwhelmed director decided to increase security and prohibit all unauthorized visits. The residents, intrigued, exchanged hypotheses in low voices. Some saw Olivia as a silent heroine, others feared the repercussions of such attention. She, motionless, continued her routine without a word, but her gaze seemed heavier, as if she were finally measuring the weight of what she had triggered. The authorities, aware of the affair's resonance, decided to interrogate the old woman. An investigator was sent to the site, with a mission to establish the facts. It was a brief administrative visit, recorded in a succinct report. Olivia answered questions calmly, straightforwardly, simply confirming that she had kept these records for memory, not for revenge. No additional statement was recorded. Yet this minimal testimony was enough to legitimize the entire ongoing investigation. Ricardo, for his part, retreated into voluntary isolation. His assets were seized, his properties searched, and his accounts frozen. Those who had once supported him took care to distance themselves. His fortune, built on unstable foundations, collapsed faster than it had been erected. But what gnawed at him most was not the material loss. It was the feeling of being dispossessed of his own narrative, of no longer controlling the past. He discovered with belated bitterness that the choices he thought were forgotten had continued to exist in the shadows, logged by a hand he had himself cast aside. At the nursing home, the weeks followed one another in a deceptive calm. Olivia now received letters from all sides, some anonymous, others signed by people she had never met. Messages of support, recognition, sometimes anger. The staff filtered the mail, keeping only what seemed harmless. But every word read or heard reinforced an impression. The truth, once freed, no longer belonged to her. One morning, a maintenance worker discovered an unusual object in the basement laundry room, a small hard drive enclosed in a plastic envelope. The device contained encrypted files, later identified as digital copies of the missing notebooks. How this data arrived there remained inexplicable. No sign of intrusion, no electronic trace. The director decided to hand everything over to the authorities without informing the media. But the news spread quickly, further fueling the mystery surrounding Olivia. Analysts examining the files found that they contained not only copies of the known documents, but also new information, international transactions, offshore bank transfers, and confidential correspondences. This data added a new dimension to the case, involving foreign entities and unexpected partners. The scandal took on an international scale. Foreign newspapers seized the subject, mentioning a senior source at the origin of a historical leak. Reactions were mixed. Some hailed the courage of a woman who, at her age, had revealed one of the country's largest fraud networks. Others spoke of familial betrayal, of deliberate destruction, but none could ignore the precision of the facts. Olivia's image, a frail silhouette behind her room's window, became a silent symbol of truth. In the heart of this turmoil, one detail went almost unnoticed. In the digital archives recently handed over to the authorities, a file bore a strange name: Dernier Note, last note. It contained only a few lines, dated several years prior. One simple sentence was written there: everything hidden by love eventually gets revealed by memory. No signature, no context, but this phrase, in its sobriety, served as a reminder. It seemed to announce that the story was not yet complete, that something remained to be discovered. And while the newspapers speculated on this mysterious note, a discreet fact escaped everyone. The blurry silhouette spotted in the hallways during the power outage had just been identified by investigators. The image, once enlarged, revealed an unexpected detail. It was not an employee nor a registered visitor, but a person whose face strangely resembled that of a man who was believed to have been missing for several months. The investigators, reanalyzing the hallway video, were struck by a detail they had overlooked until then. The blurry silhouette, almost erased by camera interference, seemed to be wearing a jacket identical to one Ricardo often used during his discreet travels, long before the scandal broke. The resemblance wasn't perfect, but it was enough to raise legitimate doubt. No log mentioned his presence that evening, no official trace of a visit. Yet the image showed a precise movement, a hesitation at Olivia's door, then a swift disappearance down the hall. This finding forced the reopening of the nursing home's internal file. Agents went to the site, examining every building entrance, comparing signatures, electronic logs, and recorded calls. Nothing indicated that Ricardo could have entered the facility that evening, but the exact hours of the power outage coincided perfectly with a 30-minute interval during which the security system had stopped recording all activity, a coincidence too precise to be ignored. Olivia, interviewed again, remained true to her usual calm. She confirmed not having received any visit during the night of the outage and showed no surprise at the mention of the silhouette. However, the caregivers noticed a slight change in her behavior after the interview. She stayed longer than usual in the inner garden, observing the trees without saying a word, as if an old memory had just been abruptly reawakened. In the following days, new elements emerged. A grey car, belonging to a private transport company, had been spotted near the residence the day before the outage. The driver, questioned, admitted to driving a man without providing his name, dressed in a long, dark coat, who had asked him to wait 30 minutes before leaving again. The destination address corresponded to a point less than 100 meters from the nursing home. After this ride, the client had vanished without a trace. The payment, made in cash, prevented any identification. The hypothesis that Ricardo might have sought to retrieve the documents himself was considered, but nothing proved he was still able to act this way. Authorities still believed him to be abroad, concealed to avoid justice. However, the presence of a silhouette resembling him brought everything into question. Investigators decided to consult cameras in the neighboring area, hoping to trace the car's route, but the majority of the recordings had been erased, officially due to simultaneous maintenance on the municipal network. Another coincidence difficult to explain. At the same time, a series of unusual bank transfers drew the attention of the financial department in charge of the investigation. Small sums, originating from accounts indirectly linked to Ricardo's former group, were paid to several employees of the nursing home. The amounts were not sufficient to arouse strong suspicion, but their regularity over several months showed an organized structure. The beneficiaries questioned claimed to know nothing about these transactions. They all stated that they were probably administrative errors. During this turmoil, Olivia continued her routine with the same exactness. Her movements now seemed imbued with a form of anticipation, as if she knew that something, somewhere, was approaching. Nurses noticed that she frequently tidied her personal effects, ordering her papers, sorting her notebooks. She requested that certain envelopes be left in a locked box, accessible only to the director. No one knew what these envelopes contained, but their number increased each week. One employee, intrigued, once tried to glimpse the content of a sheet that had accidentally fallen to the floor. He only read a few words, traced in a firm hand. "Invisible debts never disappear." This phrase, though brief, circulated discreetly among the staff, feeding all kinds of hypotheses. Was it a confession, a warning, or simply a personal note? No one could determine. While the media continued to dissect the ramifications of the scandal, another phenomenon occurred. Some companies linked to Ricardo's former empire began to abruptly close their subsidiaries, emptying their accounts and transferring their assets to unknown destinations. Financial authorities tried to trace the funds, but a portion of them seemed to evaporate into parallel circuits outside all jurisdiction. This organized disappearance suggested the intervention of someone who still had access to the old networks. Analysts soon discovered that these operations coincided, each time, with the reception of a new anonymous file in international newsrooms. Each file contained supplementary proof, contracts, correspondence, statements. The more documents circulated, the more the network of influence shrank. Those involved tried to protect themselves, but the leaks followed one another at a precise, almost calculated pace. People began to speak of an invisible hand orchestrating the downfall of an entire system. A name then returned persistently, that of a former financial advisor to Ricardo, who had been missing for over a year, never found. Some claimed he had left the country with copies of the original archives. Others believed he had been silenced. The appearance of the silhouette in the hallway revived the idea that he might still be acting in the shadows, perhaps on someone else's orders. The investigation then took on a broader scope, mixing finance, loyalty, and delayed revenge. Olivia, silent amidst this agitation, received new official correspondences. Some bore foreign stamps, others institutional markings. The facility's director, respecting confidentiality guidelines, placed them on her desk without opening them. She read them slowly, took notes, and then carefully stored everything in a locked drawer. This ritual repeated every week, becoming almost solemn. One autumn evening, as the residence was preparing to turn off the lights, the building's alarm system triggered for no apparent reason. Sensors detected movement in the administrative area, which was empty at that hour. When security agents arrived, they found no one. However, a file had been placed on the director's desk. No employee admitted to putting it there. Inside, a set of documents bore the same header as Olivia's, but dated several decades prior. Investigators, alerted, came to examine the contents. These were internal reports from a construction company once managed by Ricardo's father. The documents mentioned a series of accidents that occurred on construction sites, concealed at the time to protect the family reputation. These revelations added a new dimension to the story. The corruption was not born with Ricardo, but had older roots, inherited from a silent tradition of compromises passed down from generation to generation. This finding overturned the public image of the clan. The affair took a historical turn, redefining the boundary between individual guilt and collective inheritance. It was discovered that many fortunes built around the same time rested on the same practices. The scandal now exceeded a single name, a single man, to become the symbol of an entire system. While society grappled with this truth, Olivia seemed strangely peaceful. Her days became more regular, almost serene. She simply requested that her window curtains be opened every morning to let in the light. This apparent calm contrasted with the external turmoil. Those around her had the impression that she was waiting for something, perhaps a confirmation, perhaps a conclusion. But one morning, at first light, an unexpected event disturbed this routine. Police received an anonymous tip claiming that an individual perfectly matching Ricardo's description had just been seen not far from the nursing home, walking slowly. On the deserted road, a briefcase in hand. The tip was initially dismissed as just another rumor, one of the many stories fueled by the public fascination with Ricardo's downfall. However, the coordinates provided in the call corresponded to a precise area only a few kilometers from the nursing home. Local authorities dispatched a patrol, convinced it was another false alarm. But when they arrived at the scene, they found recent tracks on the roadside, clear footprints oriented towards a small, tree-lined path, as well as a tire mark left by a briefly stopped vehicle. Everything seemed to indicate that a person had indeed moved on foot in the direction of the building where Olivia resided. Agents followed the trail to a discreet clearing overlooking the rear of the property. There, they discovered an abandoned object, a black briefcase, half hidden under damp leaves. Inside, there was no money or weapon, but a set of carefully arranged documents, along with an old digital camera, containing several photos. The papers bore signatures and seals belonging to former family businesses. Some were crossed out, others precisely annotated. The photographs, however, presented a troubling detail. All of them showed Olivia, at different times of her life, in places linked to the companies founded by Ricardo's family. This finding called the entire known chronology into question. How did this woman, supposedly having led a simple, modest life, find herself at the center of images, dating back over 40 years, directly connected to the origins of the fortune she herself had helped expose? Investigators began to suspect that the relationship between her and Ricardo went far beyond a simple family tie. Cross-checks were made, and old files were pulled from notary archives. Every document seemed to add a new layer of ambiguity to the story. Meanwhile, the media frenzy reached a new peak. The appearance of the briefcase reignited all hypotheses. Some claimed Ricardo was seeking to surrender, others that he was preparing a final act of revenge or a final revelation. Teams of journalists flocked around the residence, forcing authorities to establish a security perimeter. The typically quiet facility became a permanent observation point, monitored day and night. Residents were confined and visits were suspended. Olivia, for her part, remained silent, observing the comings and goings of official vehicles from her window. Those who knew her noticed a form of anticipation in her demeanor, as if the news of the sighting had not surprised her. Her gaze betrayed neither fear nor relief, only a distant, almost lucid concentration. Nurses spoke of one night when she stayed awake longer than usual, writing on small sheets that she then stored in a worn notebook. The analysis of the documents found in the briefcase revealed a crucial element: a notarized deed mentioning a share transfer carried out in the 1980s, signed by a third person bearing the same maiden name as Olivia. This signature, authenticated by experts, directly linked the old woman to one of the family conglomerate's first companies. In other words, she hadn't just worked for the family. She had been an essential link, perhaps even a silent partner. This revelation completely overturned the balance of the public narrative. Newspapers immediately seized upon this news. People stopped talking about an abandoned mother and began to discuss a forgotten co-founder, a partner erased from official history. The question took on a historical dimension. What if everything Ricardo had owned was actually built upon a shared inheritance that was later confiscated? Economists, jurists, and columnists engaged in incessant debates, attempting to reconstruct the truth. The authorities, meanwhile, focused their efforts on locating Ricardo. Contradictory clues poured in from all sides. Some said he was hidden in a secondary residence abroad. Others placed him in the same region, aided by loyal former employees. The content of the briefcase, however, seemed to indicate a voluntary movement. The footprints found nearby did match his profile. Nothing proved he had been arrested or injured. Everything suggested he was moving freely, but for a reason that was still unknown. The tension escalated further when a former executive of the group, recently incarcerated, requested to speak to the investigators. His statements added an unexpected nuance. According to him, Olivia had always had access to confidential information, even after being sidelined. She possessed copies of contracts that no one else held. He claimed she had protected these archives not to denounce, but to preserve something more intimate. The proof of a pact concluded long before Ricardo's ambitions took shape. This idea deeply unsettled the investigators. The documents recovered in the briefcase indeed seemed to testify to an ancient agreement, a distribution of shares and responsibilities dating back to a time when Ricardo was still a student. If this information was accurate, it meant that Olivia had not merely witnessed the construction of the empire, she had been its foundation. And by revealing the scandals, she had not sought public justice, but the restitution of a personal truth erased from collective memory. Security at the nursing home was reinforced. Guards remained posted day and night near her room. Despite these measures, one night, the staff noted an anomaly. The sensor on Olivia's daughter indicated a brief opening, followed by a cut in the recording system. When they entered the room, she was still there, calm, sitting in her armchair. Nothing had been moved. However, on the table, a photo that had never been seen before lay face up. In this image, clearly taken several decades earlier, one could distinguish Ricardo as a child, standing near a woman younger than Olivia, but whose features strangely resembled hers. The back of the photo bore a handwritten note. Nothing. Disappears. Everything returns at the scheduled moment. None of the investigators could determine the origin of this image, or how it had ended up there. From that moment on, the perception of Olivia changed profoundly. She was no longer just a witness, nor a victim, but the center of a tangle of inheritances, secrets, and moral debts accumulated over several generations. Each discovery seemed to rewrite everyone's motivations, transforming the understanding of their actions. The story no longer appeared to be a late vengeance, but the slow restitution of a lost balance. The authorities continued their searches, multiplying checks around the residence. Several witnesses claimed to have seen a man walking alone at nightfall in the following days, always the same distance from the gate. None dared to approach him. The descriptions matched Ricardo's, but no camera managed to capture his face. The certainty of his presence remained suspended between evidence and legend. And while investigators struggled to understand the meaning of these reappearances, another unexpected discovery was reported in the National Archives. An old file, sealed for over 30 years, had just been reopened at the request of a superior authority. The name inscribed on the cover was neither Ricardo's nor Olivia's, but a third name, never mentioned until now, linked to both of them in a way no one yet suspected. The file found in the National Archives was marked "Confidential, do not disclose," without authorization. Inside, investigators discovered a series of administrative documents dated from the late 1970s. These pages, yellowed by time, revealed the creation of a short-lived company founded by three partners: a construction entrepreneur, an ambitious young investor, and a woman identified as Elise Moreau. This last name, unknown to the general public, immediately drew attention. Signatures, addresses, and identification numbers were compared to those of the individuals involved in the current case. Very quickly, an indisputable link emerged. Elise Moreau was none other than the administrative identity used by Olivia during a period when she had disappeared from official records. This detail completely upended the timeline of events. Olivia had not merely observed the rise of the family group, she had been one of its founding pillars. Under another name, she had participated in the creation of several preliminary structures that would, decades later, become the basis of Ricardo's fortune. These companies were later dissolved, their shares transferred under male identities, in accordance with the customs of the time, where female signatures carried little weight in business. This transfer, seemingly innocuous, explained why her name had vanished from all official records. Investigators realized that Olivia had been deliberately excluded from the history in the family's early years of success. By reconstructing the exchanges between the three founders, they discovered that she had partly financed the very first construction project that launched the entrepreneur's career, Ricardo's father. Her contribution had been erased from the balance sheets, replaced by fictitious amounts and nominees. The profits, accumulated over time, had transformed into an inheritance without legitimate origin. This discovery was initially kept secret while the facts were confirmed, but a confidential report circulated discreetly among several institutions before being leaked. The press seized on it with unprecedented intensity. Olivia's image changed once again, From a silent victim, she became a figure of institutional erasure, a symbol of entire generations of women whose contributions had been deliberately obscured in great economic dynasties. In the following days, the ministry in charge of economic affairs ordered a complete patrimonial investigation into the origin of the family fortune. The network of shell companies, already weakened by previous scandals, almost entirely collapsed. Assets were frozen, and the remaining executives were compelled to testify. Several of them revealed that old instructions, signed by Ricardo himself, ordered the gradual destruction of archives likely to prove this professional filiation between Olivia and his father. Within the nursing home, the tension escalated further. Olivia received a visit from officials who came to notify her of the official reopening of her administrative file under her old name. For the first time, her legal existence regained the place it should never have lost, but she remained impassive. This return to the light, late and brutal, seemed to hold only distant significance for her. She spent the following days rereading her notes, then requested blank paper, as if she wished to record one final observation before falling silent again. Meanwhile, searches for Ricardo continued relentlessly. Several leads were explored, without success. Rumors of a flight abroad gradually died down, until a new anomaly appeared. In an abandoned hotel near the coast, a laptop was found. The device, protected by a simple password, contained a single folder entitled Origin. Inside, there were digital copies of the archive documents, as well as a short text dated a few weeks earlier. The succinct content bore neither signature nor address, but it began with a recognizable phrase: "She knew everything would end here." Investigators hesitated to release this message publicly. The tone, neutral and analytical, contrasted with the virulent accusations Ricardo had accustomed us to. It was a sober, almost administrative narrative, tracing the genesis of the family group, the gradual erasure of certain names, and the moral justification for a necessary return to the truth. No explicit confession, but a description so precise that it seemed written by someone seeking to put things in order before the end. Authorities later confirmed that the laptop bore Ricardo's fingerprints. No sign of struggle, no recent trace of movement. The location had been untouched for several days. Next to the device, a handwritten, almost faded sheet bore a series of numbers corresponding to geographical coordinates. These numbers led to a specific point: the hill overlooking the nursing home. The discovery of these coordinates immediately relaunched the search. A team went to the site and, after several hours of methodical digging, unearthed a small metal box buried under an old oak tree. Inside, a worn-covered notebook, sealed with twine, contained Olivia's latest annotations. The notebook meticulously traced the dates, signatures, and decisions she had observed throughout her life, but it ended with a single paragraph, written in a hand shakier than usual. It read, "What I protected was not the truth, but the memory. Only it can survive ownership, titles, and heirs." This notebook, once authenticated, became the centerpiece of the judicial case. Its probative value exceeded everything that had been gathered until then. It showed that Olivia had deliberately preserved the secret until the system built on the lie collapsed of its own accord. The final pages, however, seemed to have been added later, in a different handwriting but with the same ink. Experts determined they dated from a few days after the briefcase was found. These additional lines contained personal remarks about Ricardo, but written with a strange, almost analytical distance. This detail intrigued investigators. If Olivia was no longer writing at that time, who had added these phrases? Graphological analyses revealed similarities with Ricardo's handwriting, although slightly altered. This finding raised a discrete hypothesis, never officially confirmed, that he might have returned briefly to complete the work she had begun. The weeks that followed saw the definitive closure of the family group and the restitution of several misappropriated public assets. Ricardo's name gradually disappeared from the newspapers, replaced by Olivia's, now mentioned as the source of a historical redress. In public opinion, she became the symbol of a truth restored without violence, a memory that nothing could erase. One winter morning, nursing home employees found her room empty. Personal belongings remained in order, the bed neatly made. On the table, a single object, a photograph identical to the one found a few months earlier, but this time turned face down. On the back, a phrase had been added by hand, simple and indecipherable to those who first read it. Upon examination, these words were distinguished. What has been transmitted will no longer be lost. No one ever knew if Ricardo had returned to see her, or if that inscription was his handiwork. But since that day, recordings from external cameras have shown, at regular intervals, a still silhouette at the edge of the gate, observing the facade in the silence of twilight. No identifiable face, no tangible proof, only this recurrent, stubborn presence, like the discreet reminder that some stories never truly end, but slowly blend into time until they become fragments of memory that no one can ever erase.